Welcome to our Introduction to Humanities lectures. Today we're going to be talking about painting. And I have to tell you, I am recording this at home with two small children, and so if you hear anything in the background, I apologize. I will cut it short and then I will start a part two. So just bear with me. Thank you for your patience. Okay, so we want to talk about painting today. And what I want to say before I get started is that really part of, not just for painting, but really for all of the humanities, one of the things that we're really trying to do here is give you some skill sets that are going to help you not only in this class, not only for humanities, and not only really for looking at art, but I want to help you sharpen your ability to pay attention to details. I think it's kind of a lost art, especially in this probably the last 10 to 15 years, where the internet obviously has taken over everything, and everything has to be fast. Everything has to be quick, including our reading skills and our ability to look for small details. So I think, for all of us, we wake up in the morning, the first thing we do is we grab our phones and we're scrolling, right? We scroll through Instagram, we're scrolling through news stories, and we're skimming. How many of us really take 15 or 20 minutes and actually read something word for word? Maybe, hopefully, it's the Bible. Hopefully, you're doing that. But in terms of other things besides the Bible, how often are we actually sitting down and soaking in detail and not rushing? We're always rushing to get from one thing to the other. And so, if there's anything that you take away from this class, I'm hoping that you will learn the art of slowing down, looking for details, and looking for that information and thinking about it. Just taking time to just think, making connections. And it's really hard for some people, and for others, they really enjoy it. But hopefully we can all learn that skill, because honestly, our minds are not meant to skim. That's not the way our brains are wired. And honestly, I believe that's a lot of the reason why anxiety is such a prevalent thing in our society today, because we are making our brains jump from one thing to another so quickly that our brains can't keep up with that pace. And so let's return to the art of slowing down and taking in detail and thinking critically. Okay, so that's my little soapbox for today. So let's move on. Let's look at painting. So this work right here is by Cezanne. This is called Mont Sainte-Victoire. Okay, that's the name of the mountain. So let's talk about its form for a second. Think about all the different aspects of form that we've talked about. Hopefully, you're remembering some of the things we've discussed in the last couple of weeks. So when I'm talking about form, remember, we're talking about color, we're talking about line, we're talking about those specific elements that I went over with you maybe in week 2 or week 1. So let's talk about color for a second. How many colors is Cezanne using in this painting? And which colors are dominant? So we've got the blues, we've got greens and yellows. Which colors do you think are dominant? So think about that for a moment. And then which figure in the painting is the most dominant? So very likely you're going to say the mountain in the background. And so the question is, we're thinking about lines as well. How do the lines of this painting direct your vision? How do your eyes move through this painting? And is the artist using line and color to direct our attention somewhere? Okay, so we want to be thinking about that. We're going to continue, but I just want to kind of get our brains going, kind of warmed up a little bit before we move on. So just be thinking along these lines. We're going to be thinking again about form, content, medium, and subject matter. Okay? All right, let's move on to our next slide here. If I can get it to go. There we go. Okay, so let's talk about the media of painting. And again, remember, media is just the plural form of the word medium, which are the things that we use to make the painting. Okay, so let's look at 5 different ones. We've got tempera, fresco, oil, watercolor, and acrylic. Okay, now this is not an exhaustive list, but these are the most commonly used. So let's just take a look at these. Okay, so tempera. Tempera is a pigment bound by egg yolk, kind of gross, applied to a surface. And if you've ever worked with egg yolks, you know they're extremely sticky. So you can see how that might work well here. It's flat and difficult to change as applied, so it's not very forgiving. You can achieve precise detail using a tempera. And this is an example right here. This is Giotto's Madonna Enthroned. And again, all of the Renaissance and kind of like leading up to the Renaissance era works really feature a lot of the Mary and Jesus theme, the Madonna and Child. I'm pausing to give you guys some time to make notes. I want to encourage you to go ahead and take notes, even though you have this and you can save it, this presentation. But if you write it down, you are, I don't know what I don't know what the actual number is, the research, but you're much more likely to remember. And hopefully the goal in the course is to gain knowledge and not just to pass the class. Okay, let's move on. Next we have fresco. Okay. Fresco. Here's an example of fresco. This is Michelangelo's Creation of Adam. And this is sort of the centerpiece of the Sistine Chapel. If you've ever been to Rome and you go to the Sistine Chapel, you'll look up and you'll see there are different, like almost different squares, like all these different frames of different things happening, and some of it's mythological and some of it's biblical. This is the sort of the centerpiece, the most famous, and we refer to this particular little frame as Creation of Adam. Okay, so fresco. Fresco is pigment that's dissolved in lime water, and it's applied to wet plaster as it dries. So that has its ups and downs. So the color is going to last forever because it's penetrating that plaster. It becomes part of the plaster, and it really binds to it. So it's basically impossible to wash away or get rid of it. So that's good. So that's why this has lasted for so long. But the downside is the artist has to work really, really quickly because you have to have it the way it needs to be before it's dry. And so there's very little room for error. So it takes a very, very skilled artist to be able to work with fresco. Okay, so again, the color will last as long as the wall itself. Okay, next we've got oil. This is probably a very common one that we know today. Oil is a mixture of pigment, linseed oil, varnish, and turpentine. Probably smells wonderful. It's durable and highly pigmented and very blendable. So artists were really able to get a very realistic usage of color. And it's slow drying, so it's very forgiving. The artist can really control that final product. Watercolor. We've probably all worked with watercolor at some point if you were in an art class in elementary school or middle school. So watercolor are pigments bound in a water-soluble adhesive. They are slightly translucent, so much different than oil, which is more thick and buildable. But watercolor is very sort of thin and of course watery. And the paper is going to show through. So you'll still see sort of the paper texture through the paint. Again, the artist will need to work quickly because once it's dry, it's dry. And it's not very buildable. And so once what's on there is kind of what's on there. Hard to kind of cover any mistakes. And it's not very precise. It's very difficult because it's so watery. It's difficult to make really fine, small details. And so we get this sense of impressions, and we'll talk about the Impressionists in a minute. But we get these really more of a sense of impressions rather than a very detailed, as realistic as possible sort of look. Okay. Acrylic. This is a choice of most modern, or not most, but many modern painters today. It's a form of plastic resin, and it's very quick drying. The color lasts and does not change, and it's very similar to oil paints, so it's a pretty popular choice. This is Morris Louis Beta Lambda from 1961. Kind of has that 60s vibe to it. A few other media and mixed media. So one we've got is ink here. And then mixed media, combination of media, is Duco, aluminum paint, house paint, sand, and I'm not sure why I wrote Andy Warhol. I think just because he used mixed media frequently. Silkscreen ink and acrylic there. So he used a combination of those. And then prints. So woodblock prints were very popular back in sort of the Northern Renaissance era. If you see the painter called Dürer, he did a lot with woodcuts or etchings, and you could make prints with those. So these are a few other media and mixed media usages, and I'm just going to keep moving here. Okay, let's talk about the elements of painting. So when we're talking about elements of painting, we're going to talk about the elements, and then we're going to talk about composition. So those are sort of the two aspects, okay? When we're talking about the elements of painting, we're talking about line, color, texture, composition. And composition then are sort of the bigger, like take a step back and look at how all the pieces work together as a whole. So these are the more detailed items of the painting. Okay, so let's look at line first. A line, obviously, hopefully we know what a line is a continuous marking made by a moving point on a surface. And it's going to outline shapes, contour areas, and we want to think about what kinds of lines we're seeing. What kinds of lines is the author using? So are they visible? Do you see lines or do you not see lines? Are they harsh? Are they soft? Lines can often suggest movement. They can move our eye around the painting. And a term to know here is axis line. This is an imaginary line that helps determine basic visual directions of a painting. So we might see an axis line here moving us up the mountain toward the sky. We see a definite line here, axis line toward in the middle of the painting that's sort of dividing the landscape from the mountain itself. Okay, we're sort of gridding a line here, which is moving our eye over this way. So we've got a number of axis lines. We discussed this as well in the Goya painting, the May 1803 painting. From week 1, we discussed that. Sort of the lines of the soldiers, pointing their bayonets. And so these are lines that kind of help us determine sort of the structure that's happening in a painting. So when we're talking about different types of lines, these are 3 different ones to consider. So on the left, we have the harshest type of line. This is Lichtenstein's Hopeless, and it kind of has that comic kind of feel to it, right? The very heavy, dramatic lines. This is called a closed line. And this is more of a harsh closed line. We've got Leighton's Fleming June here. Let's see if I can zoom in. There we go. This is also a closed line because you can actually, if you get close enough, you can see the lines here, here, here. Okay, we see a line here. So there are certainly lines that we can see, but they're not as harsh over here as Lichtenstein's lines. Let me zoom back. There we go. Okay. Now, when we're looking at Renoir, we really don't see lines. If you zoom in here, I guess I can't zoom over, I can't scroll over there. But if you look closely, you do not see lines. You just sort of see very soft kind of edges that kind of blend into each other, but not an actual line. So we want to think about what each line does for the work. Okay, so we've got right here what looks like maybe two sisters or two friends that are reading together. Again, Renoir, very impressionistic. And so we're not getting that harshness. We're just getting something very soft, which kind of makes sense for the subject matter here. Okay, so this is where we're looking at line, a few different types of line. Color. A couple things to keep in mind when we're thinking about color. First is the hue, and that is the name of a color. The second is saturation, and that is the vividness or intensity of a color. So how saturated is it? You know, is it, let's go back here to the previous slide. Is it that bright, intense, vivacious orange? That's very saturated. Or, you know, we've got the Renoir, and I would not say this is terribly saturated. This is a softer sort of color here. Okay, so we want to think about hue, the name of the color, the saturation, how saturated is it, how intense is it, and its value. And that has to do with how light or how dark it is. Okay, mixing in white or black paint, of course, makes it either lighter or darker. Okay, consider two complementary colors or colors that are opposites. What do they do for the painting and for the feeling of the painting? Next is texture. And of course, hopefully we all know this is Van Gogh here, Starry Night. And Van Gogh's paintings were very, very highly textured. If you saw them in person, you would see the raised painting, the raised paint on the surface of the canvas. So texture has to do with the surface feel. Is it smooth? Is it rough? And think about the different brushstroke techniques. Different brushstrokes produce different textures, so keep that in mind. So this is very sort of choppy, very rough. So we want to think about what that adds to this. Does it make it feel like a peaceful scene, or is it very vibrant and lots of movement, and does it feel alive? Very different from what you would expect from sort of this sweeping view of like a Swiss village, or you know, wherever this is. It's obviously in Europe, but this sweeping view of like a sleepy village in the moonlight. But it's very opposite of that because of the movement we see in the sky and the texture that we feel. Coming from this painting, it does not feel like a sleepy little town. So it's very, very ironic, this work. Okay, so then let's talk about composition. So this has to do with how the different elements work together. So we're going to look at balance, gradation, movement and rhythm, proportion, unity, and variety. Balance. This should be pretty obvious. Is it balanced? Is it symmetrical? Meaning, is it very similar on each side, or is it asymmetrical? Very dissimilar. So on the bottom here, we've got the Last Supper. This is very symmetrical. If you were to draw a line down the middle of this work, you could basically lay the left side over on the right side and it would be just about exactly the same. Whereas we've got Goya's May 3rd here, and it is not symmetrical. We've got soldiers on one side forming this sort of line. Now it's balanced, but I would not say it is symmetrical. Okay, we've got sort of this hill here, so we want to just consider symmetry and balance. And what does that achieve in the work? Gradation. Gradation is a continuation of gradual changes. So we want to consider gradation in shape, gradation in color, gradation in shading, and this is of course the echo of a scream that we looked at on the first day. And so we want to think about, there's quite a lot of gradation in terms of color here and shading in some of these metal areas. And we even have sort of this repetition of shape. We've got this large head and then the small head. We could think of that as a type of gradation in shape as well. Movement and rhythm. So think about movement. How does the movement contrast in each figure here? We've got Adam on the left and we've got God on the right. Who is moving or moving more? And what meaning, what content do you think we can gather from that? So I want you to be thinking about that. But the way a painting controls the movement and pace of our vision is something that we want to take into account because, for instance, if we're looking here and we're saying, okay, Adam is somewhat stationary and God is moving, and we could make an argument, is he moving away from Adam? Has he already touched his finger and he's moving away? Or is he moving toward him to breathe life into him? So we could kind of argue either way. But either way, God is the one moving and Adam is not. So what does that mean? Hopefully for Christians, as Christians, we can say God is always moving. God is the one on the move, and we can't move until God moves first. There's a lot of content we could gain from that, right? So we want to think about movement. Proportion. Proportion has to do with emphasis. What is emphasized by the scale of sizes and shapes here. So think about, this is Madonna enthroned, again, a very common subject matter here, Mary and Jesus. So we've got Mary in the middle here, the largest figure, with holding Jesus, and then she's surrounded by the prophets. And so what does this sort of proportion achieve? What does it accomplish? That Mary is the largest and she's central, and then we've got these small prophets around her. What might that mean? Well, we might suggest that she's the most important, since she's in the middle and she is the largest. Okay, so the proportion has to do with how big is the important thing versus how small is the small thing. She's quite a bit larger than the others. So we might suggest that she's the most important. Unity has to do with the togetherness. So there might be contrast, but this has to do with details to the whole. Okay, so how unified is the work? This is Picasso's Guernica. Variety. Variety has to do with contrast of details and regions. So we might say that there's quite a variety in color here. We've got the very rich red tones here, and then this contrast into like this sort of gray brown, and then this vibrant blue teal color. So this is very has quite a bit of variety in color, and then variety in shape we could also consider. This is O'Keeffe, Georgia O'Keeffe, Red Rust Hills. And so that concludes the composition elements. And so now let's talk for a moment about abstract paintings. Okay, abstract work, it can often be sort of a thorn in students' sides, or at least it is until they have this particular insight or teaching that I'm going to discuss with you. So one of the reasons that people are frustrated by abstract work is because they don't feel it represents anything. Like, what is that supposed to be? It's a frequent question. Okay, so we can feel frustrated when we look at an abstract painting because we can't always figure out what it's supposed to be, meaning we don't understand its subject matter. And honestly, that's a very human and natural response because our brains are programmed to automatically try to figure out or recognize an object or what event that's supposed to be. What is that supposed to be? What is that representing? And that's called representational painting. Okay, when we're trying to represent something that's out there in the world. So if I am looking at a tree and I paint a tree, I'm trying to represent a tree in my painting. Now, abstract work is not representational or non-representational. Okay, so that means it doesn't represent anything out there in the world. And we have to let go of that a painting or a photograph or something has to represent something in the world. It doesn't have to do that. So an abstract work does not represent anything out there in the world. So it's the opposite of representational. And so what is the point then if it's not representing anything in the world? Well, in abstract works, we are free. You can think of it as a sort of freedom. We're free from trying to represent something in the world. So what is the subject matter then in an abstract work? The subject matter is sensa, okay? Now, sensa, your book will tell you, are the things that stimulate the senses, okay? So the subject matter is really our senses, okay? The things that stimulate our senses. So right here in this work, we might look at this and we see an overwhelming amount of red. Well, how does that make you feel? What kind of response do you have to that? That's your subject matter, okay? Your sensa, the way that the way your senses are stimulated, okay? So your eyes might be overwhelmed. My eyes hurt. I feel the sense of red. Red might convey a sense of urgency, could convey anger, okay? And so we could just think about what kind of freedom this gives a painter, okay? In representational works, sensa are used to portray an object, but in abstract work, the sensa are free, and they're just depicted for their own sake. So really, an abstract work is just there to give us some sort of a sensational response. Okay, our sense is responding to it, and that's really all. So we can just enjoy the sensations that an abstract painting gives us without worrying about what it's trying to represent in the real world. So free your mind, and it's okay if something doesn't represent something in the real world. That's what abstract painting is, and you can just enjoy the sort of senses that that a painting gives you or a sculpture gives you. Okay. A term to know here: presentational immediacy. This is kind of an interesting one. So we're often, oftentimes when we're looking at a work, and we could take Mont Saint Victoire, for example, the Cézanne painting that we looked at in the beginning. So we might think about France, where that is, when we're looking at it. Or if we're looking at Picasso's Guernica, which was that long black and white one on Unity. Let me go back here. This one, okay? We're looking at Guernica. And the subject matter really, it has to do with Guernica in Spain, right? It represents this bombing that took place. So if we're looking at either of those paintings, we might think about France, we might think about Spain, we might think about war. But here, when we're looking at something abstract, it's not portraying an actual event or a thing or a place. So we're really only thinking about the painting itself. And that gives us presentational immediacy. It's this idea that we're forced to focus on the here and now. We're forced to focus on this painting, and we're not being taken anywhere in our minds or thinking of anything else. We're just thinking about this painting in this moment. So this is called presentational immediacy. And this is Gorky's Untitled, in case you wanted to look it up later. Okay. Okay. Let's look at a couple of groups of painters. Just want to look at these two really quickly. The Impressionists. Okay, this is a school of painters, roughly 1870 to 1905. And this is maybe my favorite group of painters in history. I don't know, I just really enjoy this work, and I really enjoy this time period, I think, as well. This is Monet. And really, this painting kind of kicked off this movement. And Monet was really kind of the first to do that. And obviously, we think of Monet and we think of, his water lilies paintings he's very famous for. Maybe you've done a puzzle with water lilies on it. But this is called Impression Sunrise. This is 1873. And really, this was such a departure from the work that went before. Really a rejection of trying to represent something exactly and trying to make it perfect. And really this sort of freedom to just convey impressions, just a sense of what was there, a sense of movement. The details, again, are very muted. We kind of get a sense that there may be maybe ships or like a shipyard in the background. We don't really know. We just kind of get a sense or an impression of this moment, like a snapshot, almost like a photograph, like a snapshot of the moment. And what stands out the most, again, is the sun and the way it's reflecting on the water and illuminating the sky. And so really that's kind of our focus here as we're looking at it. So this work was shown at the first show of Impressionist paintings, and a lot of people sort of poo-pooed this because it was, oh, anyone can do that. Some hack, could do this. But it really started to gain steam over the next few decades. This is another kind of impressionist work, semi-impressionist work. This is Manet, who kind of was a painter who sort of bridged between sort of the painters that went before and the impressionist work. He was sort of somewhere in the middle. This is called A Bar at the Folies Bergère. Again, one of my favorites. And I'm gonna choose this one as one of your group work options. We'll talk about that in a second. Actually, we'll talk about that. I'll kind of go over the details when we dial in on Wednesday. But this is A Bar at the Folies Bergère. And this is Edouard Manet. So there's Manet and Monet. This is Bertha Morisot, Portrait of a Young Lady. Again, we've got that very impressionistic work. We're not trying to depict things exactly. We got a great sense of movement with brush strokes and color here. And then the other group of painters I wanted to discuss are the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. So this was a school of painters in the mid-1800s. And they really felt like those who followed Raphael, who was a Renaissance painter, were evolving in the wrong direction. So they kind of went back in time, almost trying to erase everything that happened after Raphael, kind of starting at that point. And they sought to, instead of trying to portray objects as realistically as possible, which is what those painters were doing after Raphael, they sought to return to a medieval style of painting. And so they had many of their works portrayed spiritual or religious subject matter. And the media were kind of meant to imitate tempera, which is what was used. Again, that's that egg yolk base medium. Which was of course, the medium that was used in the medieval paintings. So these are a few works by the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. This is Henry Wallace, The Death of Chatterton. It does have a very medieval kind of feel to it. This is Rossetti's Proserpine. I'm not sure how to say that. Proserpine. This is Hunt, William Holman Hunt, Awakening Conscience. This is 1853. So again, not the most realistic of paintings, but returning to sort of that medieval style and medium. Okay, so this is something I'm going to have you guys do on Wednesday. I'll come back to this, but we're going to do some group work, and we're going to be looking at context, the historical context, the elements of the painting, the composition, and the content. So we're going to do some group work on that. So these are a few of the options that I'm going to give you. So we'll discuss this more. But this is Vermeer, Woman with a Water Jug. This is Georges Seurat, A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte. This is Raphael. Just talked about the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. This is Raphael, The School of Athens. Again, a very famous work. Warhol, Gold, Marilyn. Okay, so we're gonna look at these. I'm gonna have you guys sort of get in groups, which is gonna be interesting. But we're gonna give it a try. I'm gonna have you guys get in groups and look at some of these works and work together on that. So I'll give you more detail as we get closer. But that is gonna wrap up our painting for today. And so your next PowerPoint is going to be on photography. So take a look at that. Disregard the second bullet point there. That's not accurate for where we're at as a class today. But that's going to conclude our painting study for today. So make sure you're reading closely the painting chapter, and next step is going to be photography.